I want to start adding some mud effects along the lower part of the model here, and I'm going to go for a darker mud, darker reddish brown mud along here. Now, this time I'm going to use Vallejo's. It's called brown engine soot. Now, even though it's designed to be brown engine soot, it works really well as mud because it's got some texture to it. It's got some thickness to it, but it's not grainy, which sometimes looks, depending on the application, just sometimes looks a little out of scale in my mind. So I'm going to put this on now. Put it on fairly heavily. It'll dry. It won't dry with as much volume as it goes on with, but it will. If you just leave it on like this, it's just going to look pretty much like that. If that's what you're going for, cool. That's fine. But what I'm going to do is get a little water on my brush now and just start kind of blending that around, reducing the opacity a little bit. That's something that I think really needs to be, I'm getting more water, needs to be considered, I think, more often working on weathering and just about any application on a model. Opacity. I think in so many cases when people send me photos and ask me about, what would you do different, or what do you think of this, or I'm having trouble with this, can you give me some advice on, what I need to be doing in this case? Almost always, when it comes to weathering and even painting, a lot of times, it comes down to the opacity. And just lowering the opacity of whatever you're working with is really going to give you more flexibility. Even if you're using it, you don't have to be using acrylics. This is acrylic. But even if you're just using oils or enamels or something like that, reduced opacity is going to make things a little bit easier. You're going to have better control. You can build stuff up. And like here, you saw how heavy that stuff was when I put it on. And I'm just knocking it back. And what I'm looking for when I do that, I put it on very heavy. And then as I start blending it back, there's a certain point that I'm just looking for. What I was really looking for was to see just a little bit of the background color coming through. Just a bit of it. Not completely, wipe it all away, but I'm just looking for a bit of that background color to come through. Now I do want to give this some volume, so I'm going to use some Vallejo pigments. This is burnt umber, and it's fairly dark. It's going to have very much a reddish look to it, but that's what I'm going for. So I just put this on here like this. Now I would suggest, and I did this. Don't think I'm just doing this just straight first time right here. Anytime you're using a combination of colors on your model for weathering, for whatever, test it on a test model first. And I've done this because I wanted to see what using this darker pigment, and I had a choice of several that I could have used, and I picked this one because in testing, it gave me the look that I wanted. So I'm going to put that on there. And again, that looks kind of stark. But what I'll do is get a little Vallejo model wash next. Now I've put this Vallejo model wash, European Dust, in my palette. And what I'm going to do is just go through and just begin letting that soak into it. Now it will dissolve some of that pigment into itself, which is okay. And you can do this as many times as you think is necessary. Put it on, let it dry, see what it looks like, add stuff back over it. Now there are textured products that I could have done this with faster. But the reason I didn't use the textured products I have a little more texture than I wanted. And so I thought doing this method would kind of build it up and let me get something that's more to what I'm looking for. I want it to be grainy. I want it to be slightly textured, but I don't want it to be giant lumpy mud. I'm going to go back to that engine soot, and there's just a few areas that I want to put in some extra mud, like it would collect there up under these places like this, just to suggest that it gets splashed up under there. And these are the little details that really nobody's going to look at, but if for some reason somebody did, they would go, oh, okay, I see what you did there. So I'm just putting this in, blending it a little bit. You could thin this on the palette and work with it that way, and it works fine that way too. I just like kind of doing it on the model. It's kind of like if you've, not that I'm comparing myself to him in any regard, but it's kind of like if you've watched Bob Ross, and the technique he uses is essentially wet on wet blending on the canvas. And that's kind of what I think of when I do this, is that, I like putting the products on the model and then kind of blending them on the model, and just using that as my palette, so to speak. But it's just a matter of keeping up, playing with the opacity, and just adding things in as you think they need to be there. Like I'm going to get some of this Vallejo model wash and just put in a few little stipples of mud color here and there, like this. And it's right when you say it's right. Here you can see the other side of the model. I already had that done. You can see how that ends up looking. To me, that looks like, some mud accumulation that's dried up. If you wanted it to look less like dirt and more like mud, just add some gloss to it. Either use a gloss product or add some gloss into whatever you're using, or put some gloss over it, just some spots of gloss. And you can always put wet stuff on top of dry stuff so that it looks like some of it's wet, some of it's dry, and just increase the realism. That's not what I'm going for, because I'm figuring this is sitting in place, firing artillery shells, and so the mud has had time to dry. But that's I'll call that pretty decent. I'm happy with that. And I'm going to paint this blanket this really kind of pale green. It's a mix of German camo olive green and ivory, both from Vallejo. But nothing special about this particular color. I just wanted it to look like a faded army blanket. I'm painting the straps Vallejo leather brown. The buckles get a coat of lead belcher. Now I'm going to completely coat it in Vallejo's Umber Game Wash. It's basically like a Citadel Agrax Earth Shade. Now with that shading in place, I'm going to go back and just start reestablishing some highlights with the original base color, making sure to not paint down into the recesses where the shade has settled. And also leaving some of the tinted area as it is, because it just looks a little dirty, a little darker. Add some tonal variety. Now on the leather straps, I'm going to use Vallejo Saddle Brown, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint in some edge highlighting along the straps, but I'm also just going to stipple in a little texture here and there along the strap, just to make it look a little bit like distressed leather. All right, I'll call that done. I can live with that. I could have put in more shadows, more highlights, built up the gradients a little more, but I think for the way the rest of it looks, it kind of fits in with it. Plus, I'm just happy with that. I'm one that when I get to a point that I'm happy with it, I go, yeah, I'll stop there. So I'll leave it there. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Same techniques, just maybe slightly different colors. There's a few more elements there. There's some grenades over here and a gun and a coffee cup and, of course, the packs. But same techniques to paint that in. But the next thing is the tools. Now for the tools, you can work from different angles from this, I think. There's always the case that, okay, they're attached to the vehicle and then they're painted with the vehicle. And that's realistic. I've seen that in my own time in the military. And then you just weather it from there, basically chipping it back to wood and then metal here. Or you can make the assumption that the tools were painted a different color to begin with and then put on the vehicle. Just for the sake of distinction, I'm going to go with that theory. Again, I've seen that in real life. I've seen both cases. So I'm going to start off and I'm just going to paint everything, including the tool head and the handles, with this Vallejo dark gray. I like this because, as I've mentioned before, I generally don't use straight black, just pure black, because you have nowhere to go for shadows. I like this because it's got just a little bit of coldness to it. It's got just a little bit of bluishness to it, which I just, in an artsy-fartsy sense, I think is a nice contrast to the warm tones of the rest of the model. So I'm using that just so that I can sound artsy-fartsy when I describe it on video. I'm going to use this Vallejo neutral gray, and over the metal parts, I'm just going to stipple on some neutral gray with this small makeup brush. I'm going to make it more prominent towards the front of it, where it would be making digging contact, I guess you'd say, than towards the rear of it. I'll put some on the rear of it, but not as much as up here. And up here, I want this to be completely neutral gray. And then I'll do the same thing here for the pick handle and the pick head and all of that. All right, one more round of stippling, this time with Vallejo Sky Gray. And this is going to be a lighter application, more towards the digging surface, but I can put some back here to whatever you think looks right, basically. Now on the handles, I use the same kind of process, although I want to go a little heavier for this. And this is going to be using this Vallejo old wood. Now I may have to get a brush to get really up into the parts, kind of where the handle curves underneath and stuff like that. But the main thing here is just stipple this on, leave just a little bit of the black showing. Now for a little contrast that probably nobody will notice, I'm going to use this Vallejo buff. Get out of there. Little bug's been flying around all morning. I'm going to use this Vallejo buff to just add some more texture to it. This is way out of scale, but what it's doing is trying to invite the brain to accept that this is wood texture. Now over the wood, I'm going to put this Vallejo dark yellow model wash. It's actually more of a dark green, but when you put it on, it tends to shift things a little towards yellow. I like this over the wood because when I go out and look at my shovel in my garage at the handle, it was originally painted a color and then it's worn down to mostly wood, and it just has this kind of greenish yellow tint to it. I don't know if it's, you know, from some kind of fungus that's growing on it, or it's just the way the wood looks or whatever like that, but it's just got this kind of tint to it. So I'm going to add it on here. All right, now I'm going to use another Vallejo model wash. This one is rust. And I'm just going to stipple on some of this rust wash in a fairly thorough coat, but leaving some patches unrusted. And I'm going to shift it more towards the end here where there's going to be more of a bare metal look like that. But just get it kind of rusty looking. And the same for up here. Now, final step will just be to use this mechanical pencil and put in just some graphite shine right there along the edge. It's going to be digging into the earth. It'll just give it a little bit of a metallic shine. Now, I'm demonstrating this now for the sake of getting it on camera, but in reality, I would probably wait to do this to the very last step, because if I put a matte coat over this, it will completely dull down the graphite shine. So just keep that in mind. All right, and you can see there, I've done this in just about real time, probably about 25 minutes. Doesn't take long. I could have taken longer. I could have used oils and enamels and all of those things, but just for the sake of getting it done, use just acrylics, and it'll work. In the bigger picture of the whole thing, it'll work. And I'll go ahead and call this the episode. Still a little bit to do, some details. I'm going to do some of this off camera. You guys are probably tired of seeing this thing. I'm ready to move on. So there's a few things I'm going to do, just some detail painting that I'm going to do off camera. Probably wrap it up in the next episode, and then move on to something else. Well, one other note to point out, you would of course want to do a little bit of weathering over this to put some dirt, dust, whatever like that. I'll catch that up later. But I hope this has been helpful. I like painting little details like that. It's fun. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for being a patron. And, you know what I say. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.